How far would you go for justice if you were treated as less than human? Elena Cruz, a hard-working Filipino single mother, was thrown out onto the streets by her ruthless landlord, Mr. Bradford, who never cared about her struggles. To him, she was just another tenant, another problem to get rid of. But now, tables have turned. Will she seek revenge or prove she's stronger than him? Stay until the end to find out, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. The heavy pounding on the door made Elena Cruz's heart stop. She didn't need to look. She knew exactly who it was. Mr. Bradford, her landlord, the man she had been dreading for weeks. She turned quickly to her 8-year-old son, Mateo, who was sitting on the couch, gripping his worn-out toy car. His wide brown eyes filled with concern as he looked up at her. "Mateo, sweetheart, go to your room," she whispered, forcing a smile despite the fear tightening in her chest. "But Mom," "Now, Mateo, please." He hesitated, but then nodded and shuffled toward his tiny bedroom. Taking a deep breath, Elena stepped forward and pulled the door open. There stood Mr. Bradford, tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in a gray suit. His cold blue eyes flickered with impatience as they swept over her small, dimly lit apartment before settling on her. "Miss Cruz, you're 3 weeks late on rent," he said, his tone as sharp as a knife. Elena's stomach clenched. "I know, Mr. Bradford, but please, I just need a little more time." "My son was in the hospital and I had to." "Not my problem," he interrupted, his voice flat. "This is a business, not a charity." She swallowed hard. "I can pay part of it now, and I swear I'll have the rest by next week." Bradford let out an exasperated sigh and pulled out a folded document. "You have 24 hours to vacate. If you're still here tomorrow, the sheriff will escort you out." He shoved the eviction notice into her hands and turned away without a second glance, walking briskly to his sleek black car. Elena stood frozen, gripping the paper as her world collapsed around her. She closed the door, leaning heavily against it. Her breath came out in short, shaky gasps. Tears burned at the edges of her eyes, but she wiped them away quickly as Mateo peeked out from his room. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" Elena forced a smile, pulling him close. "Of course, sweetheart. We're going to be just fine." But deep inside, she wasn't sure if that was true. The night air was cold and unforgiving as Elena Cruz and her 8-year-old son, Mateo, stepped out of their apartment for the last time. The weight of their few belongings felt heavier than it actually was, as if it carried the burden of their uncertain future. Elena tightened her grip on the suitcase handle while Mateo clung to her other hand, his small fingers curling around hers for comfort. He said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. The flickering streetlights cast long shadows as they walked down the cracked pavement toward the only place they could afford, a cheap roadside motel. As they entered the tiny, dimly lit room, the stale scent of cigarette smoke and mildew filled Elena's nose. The bedspread was worn and faded, and the heater made a low, rattling noise, struggling against the chill. Mateo sat quietly on the bed, his toy car still in his hands, while Elena forced herself to stay strong. "Just for a little while, sweetheart," she murmured, stroking his hair. Mateo nodded, but the way he held onto her sleeve told her he wasn't convinced. The next morning, Elena got up early, careful not to wake Mateo. She pulled on her work uniform, a plain button-up and an apron that had seen better days, then kissed his forehead before heading out. The bell above the small bakery's door chimed softly as she stepped inside. The familiar scent of fresh bread and warm vanilla filled the air, bringing a brief moment of comfort. She had worked here for 5 years, and despite the struggles of her personal life, she never let it affect her job. By mid-morning, the bakery was bustling with customers. Elena moved from table to table, balancing trays, pouring coffee, forcing a smile despite the exhaustion weighing her down. It was only when she approached a familiar face at the corner table that she allowed herself a breath of relief. Mrs. Montgomery, a well-dressed elderly woman in her late 60s, sat sipping a cup of tea. Her silver-streaked hair was neatly tucked behind her ears, and despite her quiet elegance, she had never once treated Alina like she was invisible. "You look like you haven't had a decent night's sleep in weeks, dear," Mrs. Montgomery observed, her voice gentle. Alina stiffened, caught off guard. Customers rarely commented on her appearance. She forced a small chuckle. "It's just been a rough few days." Mrs. Montgomery didn't look convinced. She set down her cup and studied Alina with kind but knowing eyes. "I won't pry, but I can see you're struggling." Alina hesitated. Her instinct was to brush it off, pretend everything was fine. But today she was too exhausted to keep up the facade. With a heavy sigh, she lowered her voice. "I lost my apartment. My son and we don't have anywhere to go after tonight." Saying it aloud made it feel too real, and for the first time in days, a lump formed in her throat. Mrs. Montgomery nodded slowly, as if she had been expecting something like this. Then, after a long pause, she spoke the words that made Alina's breath catch in her chest. "I might have a solution for you." Alina wiped her hands on her apron as she stepped out of the bakery, exhaustion settling deep into her bones. The evening air was crisp, wrapping around her like a cold reminder of how much her life had changed in just a few days. Matteo clutched her hand tightly, his small fingers curled around hers, his toy car sticking out of his jacket pocket. Mrs. Montgomery stood waiting by the curb, her elegant presence standing in stark contrast to the world Alina felt trapped in. "Come with me, dear," the older woman said gently. Alina hesitated. She had learned never to trust opportunities that seemed too good to be true. But then she looked down at Matteo, his big brown eyes filled with curiosity and exhaustion, and she knew she had no choice. They walked in silence, the rhythmic sound of their footsteps echoing against the pavement. Alina's mind raced with possibilities. Was Mrs. Montgomery offering charity? A temporary place to stay? When they finally arrived, Alina stopped in her tracks. Before her stood a small but well-maintained apartment complex, the kind that radiated warmth rather than cold indifference. Flower pots lined the stairway, and the windows glowed softly with light. It wasn't fancy, but it was homey, something Alina hadn't felt in a long time. Mrs. Montgomery turned to her, her expression unreadable. "I own several rental properties around town," she said, gesturing toward the building. "This is one of them, and I need someone trustworthy to manage it." Alina's eyes widened. "Manage?" Mrs. Montgomery nodded. "You and Matteo can live here, rent-free. In exchange, you'll oversee the building, handle tenants' maintenance requests, and keep things running smoothly." For a moment, Alina was speechless. "But I don't have any experience," she admitted. Mrs. Montgomery's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "You've been managing a bakery, haven't you? Handling customers, solving problems, making sure everything runs smoothly. That's exactly what a property manager does." Alina let out a shaky breath. Was she really capable of this? She looked down at Matteo, who was gazing up at the building with wide, hopeful eyes. At that moment, the choice became clear. "I'll do it," she whispered. The transition was anything but easy. Alina's first morning as property manager started before the sun had even risen. She stood in the small rental office, staring at a desk cluttered with paperwork, rent notices, maintenance requests, complaints. The reality of her new role hit her hard. How was she supposed to do this? She didn't have long to dwell on her fears before a sharp knock on the door made her jump. When she opened it, Mrs. Anderson, a woman in her late 50s with a permanent frown, stood with her arms crossed. "So you're the new manager, huh?" the woman said, eyeing Alina with doubt. Alina swallowed her nerves and nodded. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" Mrs. Anderson scoffed. Ever managed a building before? No, but I promise I'll do my best. If you need anything, you can always come to me. Mrs. Anderson studied her for a long moment, searching for weakness. Then, with a slight nod, she muttered, "We'll see." Alina let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. One interaction down, many more to go. Over the next few weeks, Alina learned quickly. She handled complaints, arranged repairs, and dealt with late rent payments, sometimes with patience, sometimes with firm resolve. Some tenants were skeptical of her at first, but soon they saw how much she cared. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was building a community. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving, she was creating stability for herself and Matteo. And Matteo was thriving. Every day after school, he would run home, excited to tell Alina about his day. His laughter filled their apartment, replacing the silence that had once suffocated them. One night, as they ate dinner at their small kitchen table, Matteo suddenly looked up and said, "Mom, I like it here, I like our home." Alina's chest tightened. She reached across the table, taking his small hand in hers. "So do I, sweetheart, so do I." For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. One afternoon, as Alina was organizing rental applications, she overheard two tenants whispering outside the office door. "Did you hear about Bradford?" one of them murmured. Alina's head snapped up at the name. "Yeah, his whole business is crumbling," the other whispered. "He lost half his tenants last month. I heard one of his buildings is going into foreclosure." Alina's hands froze over the paperwork. Mr. Bradford, the man who had thrown her and Matteo onto the streets without an ounce of remorse. The man who had looked at her as if she were nothing. And now, he was the one struggling. Alina leaned back in her chair, processing the news. She had spent months rebuilding her life from the wreckage he had caused. She had cried alone in the dark, held Matteo as he slept in a freezing motel room, and worked herself to the bone just to give her son a sense of normalcy again. And now, karma had come knocking on Bradford's door. She should have felt satisfaction. But as she sat there in the quiet office, she realized she didn't. What she felt was something else entirely, something that made her wonder what would happen next. Because fate had a funny way of bringing people full circle, and she had a feeling that this wasn't the last time she would see Mr. Bradford. Alina was locking up the rental office for the evening when she heard footsteps approaching. She turned, expecting to see one of the tenants, but her breath caught in her throat. Mr. Bradford stood just a few feet away. Gone was the arrogant landlord who had once sneered at her desperation. The man before her now looked disheveled, weary, and far from the polished businessman she had known. His once impeccable suit was wrinkled, his shoulders slightly hunched, and for the first time ever there was no confidence in his eyes, only desperation. "Alina," he said, clearing his throat as if even saying her name was difficult. She stiffened. It was the first time he had ever addressed her by her first name. "Mr. Bradford," she replied, her tone neutral. He hesitated, then exhaled heavily. I need your help." Alina blinked, stunned. Her help? The same man who had thrown her and Matteo onto the streets without a second thought was now standing before her, asking for a favor. She folded her arms, tilting her head slightly. "You need my help." Bradford ran a hand through his graying hair, a flicker of shame crossing his face. "I know what you must be thinking. I wouldn't be here if I had any other choice." Alina stayed silent, waiting. He sighed. "You've probably heard. I'm losing everything. My tenants left, my properties are falling apart, and if I don't turn things around soon, I'll—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "I need someone who knows how to manage tenants, someone they trust, and that's you." Alina studied him carefully. Fate had a strange way of bringing people full circle. For a long moment, she didn't respond. Part of her wanted to say no, to walk away, to let him feel the full weight of what it was like to lose everything. But then she thought of Mateo, thought of all the nights she had spent worrying, struggling, fighting to survive. She had been in his position once, desperate, without options. And even though Bradford had never shown her mercy, she refused to become like him. Still, she wasn't about to make this easy for him. "You want me to fix what you broke?" she asked. He nodded. She sighed, crossing her arms. "I'll help you, but on one condition." Bradford tensed. "What condition?" "You must change. You have to start treating tenants with respect. No more sky-high rent, no more ignoring maintenance requests, and no more treating people like they don't matter." His jaw tightened. She could tell the words stung, because he knew they were true. For a moment she thought he would argue, that he would insist he was already a fair landlord, but instead he swallowed hard and gave a small nod. "All right," he said quietly, "I'll do it." Alina lifted a brow. "No hesitation," Bradford sighed. "I don't have a choice, do I?" "No," she said. "You don't." They sat at a small coffee shop the next morning, a notebook open between them. Alina outlined a plan, a real plan, not the greedy shortcuts Bradford had relied on in the past. "First, you need to lower the rent to reasonable prices," she said, tapping her pen against the paper. Bradford flinched but nodded. "Next, you need to start fixing the problems in your buildings. No more ignoring maintenance requests. Tenants leave because they feel neglected." Bradford rubbed his temple. "That's going to cost money." "Yes, but losing your business will cost more." He sighed but said nothing. Alina continued, laying out a strategy to regain tenant trust, community meetings, transparent policies. A complete shift from how he had run things before. To her surprise, Bradford didn't argue, he listened. Really listened. For the first time, it seemed like he wasn't just trying to save his business, he was trying to be better. By the time their conversation ended, he leaned back in his chair, looking exhausted. "I don't deserve this," he muttered. Alina studied him for a long moment. Maybe he didn't, but she knew something he didn't. True power wasn't about revenge. It was about choosing to be different from those who had hurt you, and that was exactly what she planned to do. A few weeks later, Alina was reviewing paperwork in the rental office when Mrs. Montgomery walked in, carrying a thick envelope. The older woman placed it gently on the desk, her eyes warm with something unreadable. "What's this?" Alina asked, frowning. "A proposal, dear," Mrs. Montgomery said simply. Alina opened the envelope and scanned the first page. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a deed transfer. She looked up in shock. This is Bradford's property," she whispered. Mrs. Montgomery nodded. "He came to me yesterday. He knows he can't save it alone. He wants you to take over, manage it now, own it in time." Alina's hands trembled slightly as she set the papers down. She had spent her entire life fighting just to keep a roof over her head. Now, she was being given control over an entire building. Her own future. Tears welled in her eyes. Later that evening, Mateo ran into her arms, his face lit with excitement. "Mom, are we really staying here forever?" he asked, his brown eyes wide with hope. Alina knelt down, cupping his face gently. "Yes, sweetheart, this is our home." Mateo beamed, throwing his arms around her neck. And for the first time in her life, Alina knew it was true. She had been thrown out, abandoned, left to struggle. But instead of seeking revenge, she had built something better. True power wasn't about destroying others. It was about rising above. And sometimes, life comes full circle in ways you never expect.